Everybody put everybody put your black fist in the air. One God,
One God,
One God,
one aim,
one
one
aim,
aim,
one destiny.
one
one
destiny.
destiny.
Africa
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 for the Africans.
for the Africans,
Those at home
those at
Those-
home,
and those abroad.
and
and
those
those
abroad.
abroad.
Race first.
Race first.
Of the mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Yes, absolutely.
Don't,
Dr.
don't
Shem.
speak it, it won't exist.
Thank you, Dr. Shams.
Race first.
Okay. So, we left off on question 7 the last time when we did the Africa chapter, and it's pretty packed with so much going on. It's just wow, it was a lot going on in this chapter. So I try to capture a lot, but as I say, we may not finish up everything because I have the long study questions. But Brother John, did you get those questions?
Give me one brief moment and I'll check.
Okay.
Yes, race first study questions. Let me download this.
I tried to email it with the highlights, but it doesn't look like the highlights came through for some reason.
Yeah.
Is it highlighted on the version you received?
Yes.
Oh, good. Awesome. Awesome. That helps,
And you said we're just going through the reading. I don't need to cover
Yeah,
it.
we're just going to take turns and take the questions and go through as much as we can cover. And if time permits, we'll have discussion. They're pretty detailed questions. So a lot of questions will be answered, but sometimes, these questions still sparks further, inquiry, discussion, concerns, so if we get through it, then we can do some of that, but we'll just breeze through it so we could finish as much as possible. So I guess I'll break the ice and take the first question. And question says, what are some of the reasons the UNIA flourished the most in South Africa? And so Tony Martin explored some reasons why the UNIA was flourishing well, particularly in South Africa. And of course, they pose challenges, colonialism and apartheid system. But some of the reasons that was offered is number one reason was that the Black South African experience. There was a resonating going on. So sharing of similar struggles, the UNIA message of racial pride, self-determination, and resistance to colonial oppression deeply resonated with Black South Africans. They were living under the repressive condition of colonial rule and the early stages of apartheid. And then so many Black South Africans saw parallels between their struggle and those of Black people in the diaspora. Garvey's emphasis on African liberation and unity gave them some hope for their own emancipation from white supremacy. So that's the first part. of that same question. The second part is there were inspired from global movements. So the global nature of the UNIA, which sought to unite all people of African descent across the world, appealed to the Black South Africans. The idea that they were part of a larger worldwide struggle for Black liberation empowered them and connected their local struggles to those of the African diaspora, especially in the Americas and the Caribbean. And so, number two, it was also Garvey's message of African nationalism, promotion of African independence. Garvey called for the liberation of Africa from colonial rule, and his vision of Africa as a homeland for Black people strongly resonated in South Africa, where indigenous populations were being dispossessed of their land and subjected to discriminatory laws. So the UNIA's advocacy for African nationalism and self-rule inspired Black South Africans to fight for their own independence and reclaim their identity and heritage. And also Pan-Africanism. The UNIA's Pan-Africanism vision, which emphasized the unity of all African people regardless of their location, also appealed to Black South Africans who were looking for ways to resist European colonialism and its divisions. So the idea of a unified African continent governed by Africans who governed by Africans was a powerful concept that gave hope to those fighting for freedom in South Africa. The third part of it is economic and political disenfranchisement in South Africa. This also appealed to the economically marginalized people. So Garvey's message of economic self-reliance and Black entrepreneurship resonated particularly well with Black South Africans who were economically marginalized under the colonial and segregationist system. Garvey's call for Black people to create their own business and institutions provide a path for economic empowerment, which was especially appealing to the economically oppressed Black population. Political exclusion, the UNIA's advocacy for political autonomy and self-governance also found a receptive audience in South Africa, where Black people were disenfranchised and excluded from political participation. Garvey's insistence on the necessity of political power for Black people helped galvanize movements for Black political rights and self-determination in South Africa. How long is this one? Anyway, also number 4 says influence on early South African leaders. So some of the influence were impact on emerging nationalists. It was felt among South Africa's early nationalist leaders, many of whom were inspired by Garvey's message of Black empowerment and African liberation. Leaders of the African National Congress, ANC, such as Anton Lembede and others were influenced by Garvey's ideas, particularly his emphasis on African pride and unity. Also connections to religious movements, spiritual, cultural, Christian teachings. So basically, the idea is uplift empowerment, which helps spread his message. And then UNIA organizational model appeal of Garvey's organizational approach, highly structured, organized approach to leadership with its local divisions and chapters, provided a ready-made model for organizing in South Africa. So that was another great thing, you know, the way that things were organized under Garvey was really amazing. But the UNIA emphasis on mass mobilization, discipline, and the creation of Black institutions resonated with South Africans who were looking for effective way to resist colonial oppression and build their own. Organizations. So cultural and symbolic leadership. I'll just kind of read the title of some of the rest of them, but just cultural and symbolic leadership through the use of African symbols, flags, uniform, which help to foster a sense of unity and pride amongst members. Because these were things that were denied of Black people, cultural recognition, subjected to racial humiliation. And so the UNIA's emphasis on African heritage and pride was a source of inspiration. And then limited local leadership at the time. So UNI at the time kind of filled the leadership vacuum. Broad mass appeal, vacuum offering well-developed ideological framework, and a vision of liberation that were both inspiring and practical. So the organization's presence helped to catalyze the emerging nationalist movement in South Africa. And international legitimacy, being part of the global movement, like the UNIA, gave South African activists and ordinary people a sense of international legitimacy and solidarity. So, and then cultural resonance of Garvey's ideas, racial pride and identity. So the UNIA's emphasis on racial pride and the importance of African identity strongly resonated with Black South Africans. And then, of course, religious and political themes, says Garvey's message also found resonance with African independent churches and religious movements in South Africa. So the conclusion is Tony Martin attributes the flourishing of UNI in South Africa to several factors: the resonance of Garvey's message with the struggle of Black South Africans, the organizational strength of the UNIA, the inspiration it provided to early nationalist leaders, and the cultural empowerment it fostered. So the emphasis on African pride, unity, and self-determination struck a chord in South Africa, where Black people were seeking ways to resist colonialism, economic oppression, political exclusion. Despite the harsh colonial apartheid system, the UNIA provided a vision of hope and a framework for liberation that appealed to a wide cross-section of the South African population. So I don't know what you guys take from that, but I didn't know that the UNIA had such a great impact. So I thought it was kind of important to elaborate on all of those. But so we can go to the next question. And also, if you want, you can kind of paraphrase or just read the headline. I mean, you don't have to. We'll just stop wherever we get to. But I was just thinking we could read the beginning part. We could read the highlighted versions, areas, and we can just read the summary. But of course, you don't have to do it that way. You can go through all of it if it's not as long as this one. So with no further ado, we'll go to question number 9. And anyone can take that one.
Sister Ann, will we ask some general questions on everything at the end?
If time permits.
Okay.
And everyone, if you don't mind to, Brother John, send this out to everyone, because it's a lot of stuff, and you know, we're gonna do. You mean if we're gonna have a test?
Well, no. I just a question on what we just read. That last question was specifically in regards to South Africa.
Right, this one is about, it's kind of gonna be somewhat redundant because it's asking about, it says, how was the UNIA active in the struggles for human rights in South Africa? So we could just read the this one and then the first part, and then we can just read the highlighted parts and then go to the summary, because some of the stuff is gonna be kind of similar. It kind of overlaps. So, well, let me do it and show an example. Okay. So these are the questions. It's saying, how was the UNIA active in the struggle for human rights inside of South Africa? So it's asking a question, and then it's given a little background information. It says the UNIA was active in the struggle for human rights in South Africa in several key ways. The UNIA influence helped shape the early political consciousness and organizational strategies of Black South Africans, fighting against colonial rule and apartheid. So there's some overlapping, so we don't have to read all of this again. So it says, while Garvey himself never visited South Africa, the ideas and organizational method of the UNIA played a crucial role in fostering resistance to racial oppression, promoting racial pride, and laying the groundwork for later anti-apartheid movement. Here are some specific ways the UNIA was involved in the human rights struggle in South Africa. So I'm just going to read the highlighted versions. Just say they were promotion of racial pride and African identity, support for political economic self-determination, because we had some similar ones in the first question, influence on early South African nationalist movement, also distribution of Garvey's message through the Negro world, also resistance to colonialism and apartheid, then influence on African independent churches, challenges and colonial repression. And then the conclusion says, the UNIA's influence in South Africa was profound. It's very similar in some ways to the first question, especially in terms of, from the first question was why the impact was so great in South Africa. Now we were talking about how are some of the ways that we fought in the struggle. But anyway, the UNIA's influence in South Africa was profound, especially in terms of promoting racial pride, economic self-determination, and resistance to colonial and apartheid rule. By spreading Garvey's ideas of African unity, political empowerment, and self-reliance, the UNIA contributed to the development of South Africa's early nationalist movement and laid the groundwork for future human rights struggle. Despite colonial repression, the UNIA's message found fertile ground in South Africa, where it inspired generations of activists to fight for equality, justice, and freedom. Question number 10.
Yeah,
Anyone?
Did anyone else expound on that question 9, or to answer the question 9? Or you want to wait till another time?
The questions were kind of extensive, but I kind of paraphrased it because there were some similarities in the first. The first question was asking, why did the UNIA function and did so well in South Africa? So we had several reasons that was why, how they resonate.
Yeah, I understand that. I was just wondering. I mean, Dr. Tony Martin covered some, but he didn't cover a lot of other things. I just want to know if it was.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. I was just, we don't have to rush it. I was just kind of, because I have a lot of extensive answers here. And then, so if you have something to add, that's fine. We don't have to rush through it, because wherever we get, we'll stop and then at the end, I'm gonna pass this out to everyone anyway. So what we were doing was just reading the answers here, and then,
Right.
of course, we can add to it, if we need to, or if we want to. We were just reading the answers though for speed, and if time permits at the end, we have discussions and all the questions, or whatever we're able to.
Okay, so
So if you want to take question 10, by all means,
well,
go ahead.
I was actually back on 9.
I'm sorry, you had a question on 9. So yes, let's go back to 9 real quickly, Brother John. If you can back up.
Yeah, and I actually, because I'm driving at the moment, I can't really read it, but I can hear the discussion, so I'm not able to see exactly. But based on the conversation, what you mentioned in question 9, I just wanted to point out that there were a lot of ways that the UNIA heavily, and I mean heavily, influenced our brothers and sisters in South Africa. And Tony Martin didn't so much mention how just the presence of Garveyites, many of the sea men who came in from Jamaica, from all around the world, who were organizers, who were from New York, etc. Many of them carried the Negro world, were carrying and demonstrating interest in South Africa, which began to perk up the ears of a lot of people at the time to know that there was interest abroad from Africans throughout the diaspora. Secondly, I was going to point out that the religious, but when you look at the colonization, particularly of South Africa by the British, the British had been famous for claiming that the people of Africa could not self-govern and they weren't civilized, and in order to properly civilize them and hand them back their own nation, they had to learn certain civilizing behavior and ways of governing, etc. And they said that they themselves, who were an outpost of the Roman Empire, took nearly 1,000 years to become the peak of civilization that they became. So they expected that the Africans, no less, would take 1,000 years to be civilized, and that they were when they gave their Christian Bibles with the white Jesus and the white angels and the white God and all that, the people of Africa, who they had thinking they were cursed by Ham and others, they didn't think of themselves kind of the way we were enslaved, mentally in the U.S. And so, bringing the gospel of African pride and spirituality, etc., and introducing them to some biblical characters who were of African descent, including the main character Jesus and others, did a lot to change their perspective and speed their expectations of the moment when they can liberate themselves from these people who claimed that they were lesser than. And so that part of the message resonated particularly. Many of the people like Henry McNeil Turner and others who came to South Africa as missionaries, who pushed a parallel message, also was it resonated with them as well. So that kind of catapulted the speed at which their expectations grew. But also, the Garvey movement was one of the first organizations globally that had high regard for women and organizers. And so some of the women in South Africa who otherwise would have been relegated to lesser positions in some of the different organizations that existed gravitated to the UNIA program because it offered opportunities for women to lead and govern. And many of them were inspired by that as well. But there were a lot of things that that prompted many in South Africa to start movements, like Wellington Buthelezi started, that movement over there, and he was basically, a staunch Garveyite and was reciting and repeating and using articles from the Negro World, started African World magazine, etc. So anyway, it was a lot to it, and I put a link in the chat for those who wanted to hear a little more from a friend of mine who's a scholar on. He did an extensive study on UNIA in South Africa and pointed out, close to upward of 1,000 divisions that weren't documented over there. And the whole organization itself was only 11 registered divisions, So if another 1,000 whole divisions in South Africa, which is in keeping with what the League of Nations documented, the UNIA having 2,000 divisions, et cetera. But anyway, 2,200 to be more exact. It shows the extent of the influence of African nationalism in South Africa. So that's an important point that Tony didn't so much bring out in his discussion on the matter. But anyway, those who can check out the chat and check the link out, please do so.
Yes. And the whole thing is, calling Africa uncivilized is so crazy, because if you come up on a group of people and they speak a different language from you, that doesn't mean they're uncivilized. The Roman Empire learned everything that they learned from the Egyptians, everything. When the Egyptians were reigning for centuries, there wasn't any such thing as a European. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so it's just a brainwashing. What they did was they invaded, they kill a lot of people, and then they try to brainwash the people that were left. So it's it's crazy. Yeah, but Africa was really highly civilized if you really know the deep history. So that was just all crazy that they're saying they civilized. I always had an issue when I hear that. But anyway. So, okay, thank you for adding that, Brother Miriam. There is, I was kind of surprised too, the deep influence, because I remember years and years back when I would hear about apartheid and stuff like that. I didn't know anything about the influence that Marcus Garvey had on South Africa. So this brought out a lot, So the impact, they should be further along, but so should we. So who am I to say that, But anyway, I mean, as far as the land that's still 10% of the population have, but hopefully they'll get rid of some puppets and that'll happen. But yeah, Brother Miramar, if you want to take question 10, you can go ahead. We're kind of just reading the question and the answers.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm still driving at the
You're
moment.
on the phone, right? You said you're on the phone.
I can
Oh,
take
yeah,
the next one,
But I
Sister
can
Diane.
stop and pull over and read it.
Yes. Anyone else?
I can take question 10, Sister Diane.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Brother John.
It says, what was the purpose of the Bilbo Bill of 1939? The Bilbo Bill of 1939, formerly known as the Greater Liberia Act, was proposed by U.S. Senator Theodore G. Bilbo of Mississippi. Its primary purpose was to promote the idea of the mass deportation of African Americans to Africa, specifically Liberia. Here are the key points regarding its purpose and context. Number one is proposal for Black immigration to Africa. Number two, white supremacist ideology. Number three, influence of Marcus Garvey's ideas. Number four, lack of support and failure. Number five, conclusion. The Bilbo Bill of 1939 was a proposal rooted in white supremacist ideology that sought to address racial tensions in the U.S. by forcibly relocating African Americans to Africa, particularly Liberia. While it borrowed some concepts from Marcus Garvey's ideas of repatriation, its purpose was fundamentally racist and aimed at preserving segregation and white dominance in America. The bill failed to gain support and was never enacted.
So they have this bill, and one of the things was when Garvey showed how serious he was and was trying to, of course, the whole thing got messed up, but when they were seeing how serious Garvey was and he was trying to get thousands of family to leave, then they had an issue with that. Then they were trying to stop it because they're saying the influence, so it's just crazy how they just don't know what to do with Black people. Honestly,
Yeah,
I mean,
My understanding was Mr. Garvey, or at least some leadership in the UNIA, was in some support of the Bilbo bill.
Right, but what I'm saying is the powers that be in this country, when they realize the massive amount of people that were going to Africa, Liberia in particular, they resisted that.
Hmm.
They try to spread propaganda, they try to stop the effort. But I'm just saying, on one hand, they're trying to create a bill to deport people, but on the other hand, when they see the seriousness of people to, you know, to leave this country, they try to stop it because now they're seeing a threat to their colonial power. So I just thought I was crazy how they made a bill, but once they see that there was a strong desire, then they started doing whatever they could to stop it.
Hmm.
Just a
Understand.
contradiction, you know?
Yes, yes.
I think that was financial. I think the burden on the tax of us was a little much for them to absorb. So they uh, they had to rethink it. Face first.
Race
Okay.
first.
Thank you for that, Brother Art.
Race first.
Race first.
I would like to add on to that also. I think they kind of realized how much potential Black people had as a consumer base that could be used, and that partially paid in. They partially considered that factor also, because right now we are the basic consumers in the country because we don't control our dollars, and that's all
Right.
done by purpose too. Race first.
Race first. Thank you for that, Brother Ormond. And would you like to go ahead and do question 11, Brother Ormond?
Okay. What are some of the reasons that may have accounted for the high number of West Indians in South Africa, according to Tony Martin? In Race First, Tony Martin discusses several factors that may have accounted for the relatively high number of people from the West Indians living in South Africa during Marcus Garvey's era. These factors reflect both historical migration patterns and the broader social and political context of the time. Here are some of the reasons outlined by Tony Martin. Number one, British colonial connection. Number two, economic opportunities and employment. Number three, educational opportunities and missionary work. And number four, political and social networks. Number five, historical migration patterns. Number six, shared anti-colonial sentiments. And in conclusion, Tony Martin suggests that the relatively high number of West Indians in South Africa can be attributed to a combination of shared British colonial connections, economic and professional opportunities, education and missionary networks, political activisms, and historical migration patterns. West Indians played a significant role in the spread of Garveyism and Pan-Africanist ideas in South Africa, and their presence contributed to the broader struggle for human rights and racial equality in the region.
Thank you for that, Brother Ormond. So this one we could, I guess, read all of it because I think this had came up before. Wait, why did the use of the term Back to Africa movement displeased Garvey? So I guess I could kind of read this one. So he was displeased with the use of the term Back to Africa movement. There was a word he didn't like last week, and I mean the last time we did the questions, but I was thinking it was this back to Africa thing, but it was something else. And but anyway, it was another word that we were saying Garvey didn't like. But in any event, he didn't like the term Back to Africa movement because it misrepresented the broader goal and ideology of his movement. Garvey saw the phrase as reductive and simplistic, failing to capture the full scope of his vision for global Black empowerment and African liberation. So here are some key reasons why the term displeased Garvey. So I can read these because this is kind of like something that's, it's not just the repatriation. Garvey's movement through the Universal Negro Improvement Association was not all just about repatriation to Africa. While he advocated for the return of people of African descent to Africa, he also emphasized the importance of political, economic, and social self-determination for Black people globally. So the phrase Back to Africa movement suggests that repatriation was the only goal of Garvey's movement, whereas his vision was much broader, encompassing the establishment of a strong, independent Africa and the empowerment of Black people wherever they live. So it wasn't as simplistic. And I'll just read the second part and then I'll just read the highlighted part. So global Pan-Africanism. Garvey's ideology was based on Pan-Africanism, which sought to the unification and empowerment of all people of African descent, whether in Africa, the Americas, the Caribbean, or elsewhere. So the term Back to Africa failed to acknowledge the global nature of Garvey's effort and the fact that his movement was about uplifting the entire African diaspora, not just who sought to return to Africa. So that's the main reason why he didn't like that term, because it was narrow and it didn't broadly define the magnitude of what he was doing. So the second part of that, the second number 2 says a reduction of African liberation to a physical migration. So it was more than just a physical migration. And then so it was Africa as a symbol of unity, and it was empowerment wherever Black people were. So we can look at the rest of that. You can advance it, Brother John. Also, it was too oversimplistic. It was an oversimplification of Garvey's complex vision, because he had a comprehensive goal of the UNIA, and which included building Black-owned businesses, creating institutions like schools and factories, and fostering racial pride. He wanted to build a network of strong, self-sufficient Black communities around the world, connected through economic and cultural ties to Africa. The term Back to Africa reduced these goals to a narrow focus on migration, which didn't do justice to the complex and far-reaching aim of Garvey's movement. So you can look at the next one.
Any comments, Solicitor?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Brother Mary.
I know you're trying to expeditiously get through some things, but yeah, the term, by the way, again, wasn't a term that we ever used. It was something that was conjured up by rivals of the UNIA, and primarily it was reductive. It was overly simplistic and all those things. And it was they were trying to conjure in the minds of people some other failed movements, like Chief Alfred Sam and others who had been less organized, coordinated, and they weren't really trying to do on a scale and level what we were trying to do. So they wanted to make it seem like Black folks were gonna get snatched by their hair and dragged into put in their pots and kicking and screaming, going back to Africa. to live in trees or something. This was the kind of
Right.
sinister.
With all this, yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so in the process of doing all that, Mr. Garvey clarified, that this wasn't,
Mhm.
a term of ours, and we held it in derision, etc. And yeah, we've going forward to Africa. We going coming, and it wasn't a mass migration; it was a select, migration of engineers and builders, etc., who would help make Africa build in Africa a super state. So it was, yeah, definitely their way of trying to be snide with our aims and our political objectives. I
Mhm.
can't even imagine the Jews being called a back to Israel movement when they were trying to establish some autonomy and self-governance in the land of their own, and someone just just reduce it to back to Jew land or something. It just
Mhm.
sounds crazy. But anyway, but yeah, that's I'm glad he pointed that out in there, because too many of us even who claim an affinity for Garveyism or the Garvey movement, maybe not staunch Garveyites, but some of us even still use that word, certain silly words like back to Africa. They used to call
Mhm.
Garveys self-appointed leaders and all this kind of ridiculous stuff that makes no sense.
Mhm.
And so, along with Pan-African and all that stuff. So whenever we use words by others introduced to us, that kind of gives a revisionist history of our, rich tradition and legacy. Yeah, we gotta defend it and stand up. Mr. Garvey's not here to do it, so his loyal disciples will. I guarantee
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. It trivialized something grand, and even, now they're trying to reduce, I mean, Africa to aid, and that's why now they're having the real revolution. But they're trivializing something powerful and mind blowing, and then they're like, well, Africans can't govern themselves. And so every time there's strong government and power, they try to find a way to destroy it or discredit it or propagandize it in a negative fashion. So absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that, brother Mariama. So it was a dismissal of the broader Pan-African struggle, and you can advance, global nature of the struggle, solidarity. So in conclusion, Garvey disliked the term Back to Africa movement because it oversimplified and misrepresented his broader vision of Black empowerment, African liberation, and global Pan-African unity. For Garvey, repatriation was only one aspect of a much larger and more complex movement aimed at building a strong, independent Africa and empowering Black people wherever they were. So, by reducing his movement to the idea of physical migration, the term failed to capture the full scope of his efforts to uplift and unify people of African descent worldwide. Okay, so question 13, anyone?
I'll do it.
All right. Go ahead, Brother Orman. Thank you.
Why was emigrationist impulse so strong in 1920, according to Tony Martin? According to Tony Martin in Race First, the emigrationist impulse, the desire of African Americans and people of African descent to leave the United States and other Western countries to settle in Africa, was particularly strong in the 1920s for several important reasons. These factors include racial oppression, disillusionment with the American society, economic hardship, and the influence of Marcus Garvey's teaching of Africa redemption and Black nationalism. Below are the key reasons for the strong emigrationist impulse during this period. Number one, widespread racial oppression and discrimination. Number two, post-World War I disillusionment. Number 3, economic hardships. Number 4, influence of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. Number 5, influence of earlier immigrationist movements. And number 6, frustration with integrationist strategies. In conclusion, the immigrationist impulse was particularly strong in the 1920s due to the combined effects of racial oppression, post-World War disillusionment, economic hardships, and powerful influence of Marcus Garvey's message of African redemption and of Black self-determination. For many Black people, the prospect of escaping systematic racism and building a new life in Africa, free from white dominance, represented a hopeful and empowering alternative to the harsh realities they face in the United States and other Western countries. I might add too that during that period of time, when the African soldiers returned, the brothers returned home from fighting the war with a newfound feeling of, they have made this tremendous accomplishment, this achievement. They were met with lynching. I think the summer of 1921 was the bloodiest year for Africans, even in uniform, were being hung and lynched, and that caused Black people to wake up. That was a dose of reality that woke up many people, I believe, and also sent them to the teachings of Marcus Garvey. And it also shined light on the integrationist movement. A lot of people were hoping and, expecting that once they made their sacrifice, that the doors would spring open and Black people would be received by the nation. But they saw in reality that the doors were never going to be open. Well, never going to be open, even though a lot of us still are waiting on the doors to be open after many other tragedies. But that shocked a lot of people in the teens and in the 20s. And maybe that might possibly be needed today to shock a lot of us into the stark reality that we have to do something for self and get back to the basic teachings that Marcus Garvey gave us.
Yes.
Race first.
Race first. Thank you for that, Brother Orman. It's unimaginable that you could go and fight for the country and then you are lynched in your uniform.
Right.
What kind of it's just unimaginable.
And they had German troops that they had to guard, but they couldn't eat in the same place. The German troops were eating with the European soldiers in the same area. And the Black troops were not allowed to eat in that place. There was segregation in the services also, which shook up a lot of Black people.
And then the enemies, the so-called enemies, were treated better.
True.
That's madness at the highest level.
Well, it's a system of oppression that I guess to them it doesn't seem mad, but to the rest of the world it's a totally insane system. But so far it's still being upheld. So
yeah. Yes, definitely in some ways. And in some ways, the idea of Africa should still be, a passion for us.
it's up to us to make that decision. And I think the pressure is on, and hopefully we make the right decisions with the amount of information that's available now.
Mm-hmm.
And you see what Brother Marcus Garvey did with just a stereograph machine and printing. He was able to mobilize. Well, the climate was different back then. Well, it really hasn't changed that much, even though things are done on the QT now, and lynching has transformed itself into ways that we almost take for granted. Mm-hmm. But that blatant racism wakes up a lot of people, and that the subtleness of integration will put you into a deep sleep, and it's very difficult to awake from that sleep, as we see right now in this day and time.
Yes.
Race first.
Race first. Thank you for that contribution, Brother Orman. Okay, so let's take a look at the next question, and anyone can.
I want to make a quick comment to that as well.
Yes, go ahead, please, Brother Merriman.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, one thing he did mention was, and I can attest to this personally, because I know the story of my great grandfather who was born in 1838 in Guinea, and who came here in 1850. You know, it was illegal to be transporting folks at that time, and he was a kid, you know, enslaved, etc., and got his freedom. But he lived up till 1923, and according to his son, who was one of my closest relatives, who lived up to 2004. According to one of his sons, he always talked about going back home, not because it was some, mythical place or some romantic, vision of what a homeland would be, but because he was born there and he wanted to come back to see how, if any of his family was still alive and see where he grew up, these kinds of things. So the idea of our African identity was a lot closer than many of us now, who think we FBA or ADOS or one of these other, things they popping up with every week. So our African identity was a lot more real, a lot of us actually just wanted to physically, return to our homeland. So that was another reason there may have been more interest, more appeal, because if not you, maybe your mama was straight from Africa, etc. So, it was a different climate.
This is true. Like the persecution continued today in different ways. Like we see all this stuff in the news about Diddy, or what, the guy Diddy. But anyway, we see this persecution, and I'm hearing that, not saying he was a saint, but I'm hearing that the main persecution is going on because he was part of one of the biggest beer company in the world, and they were gonna owe him a lot of money. He promoted their, not beer, but a liquor company. Anyway, I was listening to something about it, but it's just amazing how they use certain propaganda to destroy people when they're ready. So they're not lynching in uniform, but they're lynching in other ways because they've legalized also, marijuana, but they have dispensaries, even Atlanta. They have dispensaries all over the place, but people are still locked up. It's just, and then of course, somebody's got to fill their prison industrial complex. So mostly people of African descent. So yeah, the craziness continues in many ways. So yeah, but
I'm just going to quickly add, speaking of the Diddy situation, I see some of the celebrities are finally coming out and defending him. Even Stevie Wonder just came out, that he attended a few of those Diddy parties, and he ain't see nothing.
right, yes, they're focusing on baby oil, and they're not talking about the big deal that he had with the biggest liquor company in the planet, and how he promoted. They went from, I forgot the numbers, but the numbers that they made in sale when he got involved quadrupled what they were doing on their own. So they kind of use you and spit you out when they're ready, when you're getting ready to take a bigger piece of the pie. So that's basically what's happening now. His lifestyle and his things, nobody's saying that was perfect, but it's something that's not unique to them. But you know how they roll. So we'll we can
Race
talk
first.
about, yes, race first.
By
So
Well,
the way, I was joking about the Stevie Wonder. It's just an internet joke. The Stevie Wonder ain't see nothing.
That was funny. I'm cracking up over here. That was so funny.
that is funny.
but they ensnared him. Well, he ensnared himself by allowing himself to participate in the lifestyle that they live, and he was indoctrinated into that. And I guess he went willingly, and this shows you what money and fame and power and fortune will do. And once he got ensnared in there, they had him. And so he is suffering the consequences of not allowing himself to be used. And but they're using him at the specific time because there's a lot of other things are happening in the world, and we're
And it's
focusing
a distraction. It's a distraction.
right at the
Yeah.
UN,
Like what's, yeah, absolutely. Like what's going on in
at the UN, and what's going on around the world, and what's going on.
Iran could lead us to World War III, but they don't want to focus on that. And then the
You
election.
can't beat them at their game.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, they're negotiating a new world order type thing, and so all that's happening right in front of your eyes, and it's plus what's happening on the continent, and these wars and rumors of wars is a tremendous distraction. So P. Diddy's going to pay the consequences, and many of the people, but this is the revealing too, because a lot of these things, they say by the time 2024 is over, the truth should be the light in the land, and all that was done in the dark should be coming to the light. And a lot of people need this to wake up, to see the reality of where we live and how we live. And we have to stay focused on, to avoid the catastrophe, we have to really stay focused. This is a good time to get as much information into ourselves just for our own mental and physical and spiritual survival through times that we're living in now. And this is a good foundation that we're having right here and right now to refresh our minds and reinvigorate us so that we can build back ourselves in the midst of chaos. Race first.
Race first. Thank you for that, Brother Orman. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll read.
Brother Art, did you want to take 14? Or you wanted to add to that?
Yes, I will. 14. Why was Liberia, where the bulk of the UNIA's immigrationist efforts was concentrated, according to Tony Martin? According to Tony Martin, in Race First, Liberia was the focal point of the UNIA's immigrationist efforts for several key reasons, all of which were rooted in Liberia.
You're fading out a little bit. You using your phone?
No, I'm on a tablet.
Okay.
Can't hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Now.
Oh,
all of it.
According to Tony Martin in Race First, Liberia was the focal point of UNIA's immigrationist efforts for several key reasons, all of which were rooted in Liberia's unique historical and political status, its symbolic significance, and practical considerations. Here's why Liberia became the main focus of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA in their efforts to promote Black repatriation and African development. Number one, Liberia's historical role as a haven for African Americans. Founded by formerly enslaved Africans, Liberia had a unique history as a country established by freed African Americans through the efforts of American Colonization Society in the early 19th century. The country was seen as a successful example of Black people returning to Africa and building an independent nation. For Garvey and the UNIA, Liberia represented the most logical and natural destination for African Americans and other members of the African diaspora who sought to immigrate to Africa. Symbolic importance. Liberia's history gave a symbolic significance as a place where African Americans had already taken steps to reclaim their heritage and establish self-governance. The country's existence, a Black-ruled republic in a continent dominated by European colonial powers, made it an ideal location for Garvey's vision of African redemption and self-determination. Liberia was perceived as a foundation upon which to build a broader Pan-African movement. Number two, Garvey's vision for African development. Liberia as a base for Pan-African efforts. Garvey envisioned Liberia as a launching point for a broader Pan-African project. He believed that by concentrating immigration and development efforts in Liberia, UNIA could transform the country into a powerful, independent, and prosperous African state that would serve as a model for the rest of the continent. Garvey hoped that Liberia could become the center of African unity and a hub of political, economic, cultural empowerment for Africans. Building a Black empire. Garvey's ultimate goal was to establish a powerful Black empire in Africa that would be able to compete with Western powers. Liberia, as an independent African nation, is seen as the most viable place to begin building the institutions, infrastructure, and economic base necessary to achieve this goal. Number three, Liberia's political future. One of the few independent nations, African nations.
Aren't you fading out?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, that's better.
One of the few independent African nations in the earliest 20th century, Liberia was one of the only two independent African nations, the other being Ethiopia, while the rest of the continent was under European colonialism rule. The independence made Liberia an attractive destination for Garvey, for Garvey's immigrationist plans because it was not subject to direct European control. Garvey believed that Liberia's political independence provided a unique opportunity to create a strong African state free from colonial interference. Potential for partnership. Garvey saw Liberia as a potential partner for the UNIA in its efforts to promote African development and repatriation. He hoped to work with the Liberian government to facilitate the settlement of African Americans and other diaspora members, as well as to invest in the country's infrastructure and economic growth. The UNIA aimed to establish businesses, schools, and factories in Liberia to aid in the development and to create a thriving Black economy, economic and industrial development potential. Liberia's natural resources. Liberia was rich in natural resources, including rubber, minerals, and agricultural potential. Garvey and the UNIA saw this as an opportunity to develop industries that could provide economic independence for Black people and help build a self-sufficient African state. Garvey's vision included large-scale economic projects such as factories, farms, and transportation systems that will provide jobs for African Americans immigrating to Liberia while also contributing to the country's overall development. Investment in infrastructure. Garvey's planned to invest in Liberia's infrastructure, including roads, schools, and transportation systems to modernize the country and strengthen its economy. The Black Star Line, Garvey's shipping company, was intended to facilitate trade between Liberia and other parts of the African diaspora, making Liberia a key hub in the global network of Black economic empowerment. Number 5, the UNIA's diplomatic efforts with Liberia. Initial positive reactions in the early stages of Garvey's efforts, the UNIA received positive signals from the Liberian government, and Liberian officials expressed interest in working with Garvey and the UNIA to promote the development of the country. And there were early discussions about land grants and incentives for African American settlers. The diplomatic openness encouraged Garvey to focus on the bulk of his immigrationist efforts on Liberia. Hope for a strategic alliance, Garvey hoped that Liberia would serve as a strategic ally in his broader vision of African liberation and unity. By establishing strong ties with Liberia's government, Garvey believed he could leverage the country's independence to promote Pan-Africanism and resist European colonialism influence on the continent. Challenges and setbacks. Colonial interference, despite Garvey's efforts, the UNIA's immigrationist project in Liberia faced significant challenges, including interference from European colonial powers and the United States. Pardon? And the United States, which were wary of Garvey's influence and the potential destabilization of neighboring colonies. Pressured by Liberia to distance itself from Garvey's movement. Ultimately, Liberia's leadership, facing political and economic pressure from Western powers, withdrew its support for Garvey's plans. Internal opposition. In addition to external pressures, Garvey's immigrationist efforts in Liberia also encountered opposition from elements from within the Liberian government. Some Liberian officials were concerned that Garvey's large-scale settlement plans might be undermine the authorities of the existing government or create tensions with the local population. This internal opposition further complicated the UNIA's efforts to establish a foothold in Liberia. Conclusion. Liberia was the focal point of the UNIA's immigrationist efforts because of its historical significance as a Black-ruled republic, its political independence, its economic potential, and the early diplomatic interest shown by the Liberian government. Garvey saw Liberia as a key location for his African vision, where African Americans and other members of the African diaspora could return, help develop the country to create a model of African independence and unity. However, despite the initial promise, Garvey's plan ultimately faced significant setbacks due to colonial interference and internal opposition. Race
Wow.
first.
Race first, Brother Art. Thank you so much for that. Awesome. Okay, so we're up to 15. And we can anyone can take that one about King and his influence.
I'll take that.
Okay.
I'll just do the highlights.
Yes, just the main part, the highlights and the summary.
Who was king and why did he call for Afro-Americans immigration to Liberia? The king you're referring to is likely Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, a prominent African-American religious leader, politician, and immigrationist who advocated for the migration of African Americans to Liberia. Turner was an influential figure in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and was deeply involved in both the African Methodist Episcopal AME Church and the political struggles of African Americans during and after Reconstruction. Why did he call for immigration to Liberia? Number one, belief in African redemption. Number two, religious and spiritual convictions. Number three, disillusionment with America. And number four, support for Liberia. Didn't have a conclusion summary.
You can read the last one if you want to. If you want to just read the last one, since it doesn't really have a summary like the rest of them.
Oh, okay. Support for Liberia. Turner saw Liberia a black-ruled republic founded by freed African Americans as a viable destination for African Americans seeking a fresh start. He believed that Liberia, with its relative political independence from European colonial powers, offered a place where African Americans could contribute to building a strong, independent African nation.
Thank you for that, Brother John. Okay, so we can take a look at 16. Or I'll read that one. So why did Garvey dispatch Commissioner Eli Garcia to Liberia? So Marcus Garvey dispatched Commissioner Eli Garcia to Liberia as part of his broader effort to establish the UNIA immigrationist program and to solidify diplomatic and logistical arrangements for African Americans and other members of the African diaspora to settle in Liberia. This mission was an essential step in Garvey's plan to make Liberia the center of his vision for African redemption and development. So here are some of the reasons why Garvey sent Garcia to Liberia. So he sent him there to negotiate land for settlement, land for African American settlers, to establish economic partnership. So that would be investing in Liberian development, building economic infrastructures, also to strengthen diplomatic ties with Liberia. So that would be like formalizing relations with the Liberian government, securing political support for the immigration program, and also to pursue Garvey's Pan-African vision, Liberia as a base for African liberation, and then Africa for Africans. Garvey's philosophy of Africa for the Africans was central to his immigrationist effort, and sending Garcia to Liberia was an attempt to put his philosophy into practice. Garvey envisioned African Americans playing a leading role in the development of a free and independent Africa, starting with Liberia. So, in conclusion, Marcus Garvey dispatched Commissioner Eli Garcia to Liberia to negotiate land for African American settlers, to establish economic partnership, to strengthen diplomatic ties, and advance Garvey's Pan-African vision of African unity and independence. Garcia's mission was a crucial step in Garvey's plan to make Liberia the focal point of the UNIA's immigrationist and development efforts, aligning with Garvey's broader goal of Black empowerment and African self-reliance. Question 17, anyone can take that?
Yeah, I make a comment on 16.
Yes, please. Go ahead, Brother Mariam.
You know me, I don't like leaving anything out.
No, I'm glad that please, you're a major contribution, and I appreciate all your comments. So
now,
definitely.
No problem. I want to look a little deeper at why Eli Garcia was chosen. Anybody had somebody had a comment on it? Okay. Yeah, Eli Garcia, what some of you may or may not know, was from Haiti, which made his Haiti. Yep.
Okay.
So you'll notice many of the delegates from the UNIA were foreign born because the U.S. was trying to stop Mr. Garvey with everything he did, particularly from Haiti. John Joseph Adams, Eli Garcia, and Eli Garcia's roommate and best friend was another Garveyite named Eliezer Cadet. Eliezer Cadet was the first to go to represent the UNIA at the League of Nations at the Versailles Peace Conference in France. And while he was over there at the Peace Conference in 1919, that's when he first met CDB King at Du Bois's Pan-African Congress in 1919. And while he was over there, at the Congress attending, and they treated him horribly, before he left, he got to talk to King directly. And King, CDB King, who was, Charles Dunbar Burgess King, at the time, he was Secretary of State of Liberia, and soon to become president. But he made the overture there to Eliezer Cadet. Said, why don't you and the Garvey, if y'all want to help Africa, why don't y'all come establish a settlement in Liberia? And he invited them over and said he'd make every amenity possible to make sure he can facilitate the transition. And he started promising big things. So naturally, he was, communicating with his roommate, Eli Garcia, who was also, multilingual, which most people from Haiti, were not only speaking English, but speaking French and Spanish as well. So he was kind of an ideal candidate. So anyway, Eli Garcia came over there because of his talent, because of his affiliation. And also, he was, like I say, from Haiti, so it was convenient, but also, he was a very important one because of the communication that he gave Mr. Garvey as to the backhanded behavior of some of the heads of state over there in Liberia. Unfortunately, that private communication between him and Mr. Garvey was later discovered by the Liberian government, because Eliezer Cadet, Eli Garcia was telling Mr. Garvey, you better watch these jokers over here. They are cutthroat. They don't care nothing about us or the movement. And if you don't come over here with a strong enough group to be able to defend yourself, they just will take you out. But he was keeping it real with them. So when a succeeding commissioner, Cyril Critchlow, came over, he later, got scared when a couple people got killed around him in Liberia. He thought he might be next. So he ran to the embassy and was, please, take me, get me out of here. And the American embassy was like, yeah, well, give us all your correspondence with Mr. Garvey. And he gave everything. And that's when they said, oh, Mr. Garvey knew about us, huh? Well, we're going to fix him. That's where all the dirty stuff came in. But anyway, Eli Garcia was the useful. So anyways, we were talking about him. I just wanted to point out that Mr. Garvey was very strategic and specific in everything he did. He wasn't a foolhardy and just, some bumbling idiot like people portray him as, just going over there with a half-cocked plan. He had hundreds of instructions, I'm sure, that he gave Eli when he sent him over there.
You could tell it was well thought out. The people that he selected to represent, in different places, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and then, at the time, the real enemy was mostly, I mean, it was the government of the U.S., but it was also the Council of Foreign Relations, which got founded in 1922 by some of the people with the shipping board and some other groups. But their purpose was to protect American industry, and they considered it a national security threat if they didn't have access to certain uh, minerals and et cetera. And at the time, of course, the world ran on rubber, and so America had no rubber source, and so all these other European nations that they just went to war with and could possibly go to war with again had sources of rubber on the continent. And so this was their avenue through Firestone to get this fake loan to the people over there, promise them the world. We're gonna build roads and schools and hospitals and everything, which they never did, of course, and they wound up building, slavery plantations where they exploited the hell out of people. But anyway,
Right.
that was the beginning of that end, in some sense. But yeah. But so anyway, the rubber was the main motivation, as well as many in the UNIA had strong relations with people in Liberia. Some of the officers of the UNIA, not only Gabriel Moore Johnson, but Francis Wilcom and Legger, R. Van Richards, and some of these people who were high-ranking UNIA members were from Liberia who had taught over there. And of course, people like Adelaide Casely Hayford and her husband J.E. Casely Hayford, who were staunch African nationalists over there. People like Edward Wilmot Blatton historically, had a strong foundation there. So the ideas weren't foreign to Garveyism, African nationalism weren't foreign to the people over there. Some embraced them more than others. But so anyway, it was ideal fertile ground for these types of ideas to flourish again. But that's all.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. Yes, I remember reading something about Firestone, and somehow Du Bois was involved in that. But at the end of the day, all the things that they promised him never came to fruition. But they did touch on that a bit in there.
Yes, that's good information.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Did you want to add to that, Brother Orman?
No, I'm just listening and learning. More in-depth understanding,
Do you want to take 17?
Oh, yes, okay. What was significant about the secret report to Garvey that Eli Garcia put together while he was in Liberia? The secret report that Eli Garcia compiled and sent to Marcus Garvey while in Liberia was highly significant for several reasons. As outlined by Tony Martin in Race First, the report provided a detailed and candid assessment of the political, economic, and social conditions in Liberia, as well as the obstacles facing the UNIA. Immigrationist plans. The UNIA immigrationist plans. Here are the key aspects of its significance. Number one, exposing corruption and instability in Liberia. Number two, European and American influence. Number three, deteriorating relationships with the Liberian government. Practical challenges to immigration and settlement. Strategic implications for the UNIA. In conclusion, the secret report compiled by Eli Garcia was significant because it exposed the deep-rooted corruption, instability, and external influence in Liberia that threatened to derail the UNIA's immigration and development plans. Garcia's candid assessment forced Garvey and the UNIA leadership to confront the political, economic, and logistical realities of working in Liberia, leading to a reevaluation of their strategy. The report highlighted the complex challenges of implementing Garvey's vision of African redemption in a context heavily shaped by both internal dysfunction and external pressure from colonial powers and the United States. They didn't mention that the Africans who Americans who purposely created a problem for Brother Marcus Garvey. But I'm sure my brother will also give us information on that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brother Orman. There was some mention of the way that Du Bois negatively impacted things for
Yes.
Liberia. Yes. So I think one of the question had some of that in there. Yes. So question 18, anyone? Or I'll take it. If-
I wanted to,
Okay, yes, go ahead. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Brother Miriam.
since you were mentioning, I don't know if the next part covers the Du Bois involvement, but I was gonna
Yes,
give you
there
a
is
quick.
there is one question that does ask about it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just yield for that. That's all I was gonna talk about. Since you mentioned it, I was gonna bring it up. But yeah, I'll wait for it to come up.
You want to take that one, Brother Miriam? 18?
Number 18. Yeah, I guess
Oh,
I
yes, I
can.
keep forgetting you can't see to read on the phone. No worries, I'll do it.
I
Keep
can.
forgetting.
Yeah, I pulled over for a second. Okay.
Okay.
How did the Liberian Machiavellianism or the duplicity impact the UNIA's Liberian efforts? According to Tony Martin, Machiavellianism or duplicity of the Liberian government played a crucial role in undermining the UNIA efforts to establish an immigrationist program in Liberia. The term Machiavellianism refers to the manipulative, deceitful, and opportunistic behavior exhibited by Liberian officials in their dealings with Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. This duplicity had several significant impacts on the UNIA's Liberian initiatives. Number one, the initial enthusiasm and subsequent reversal. False promises. Yes, Lord. Initially, the Liberian government seemed enthusiastic about the UNIA's plans. Liberian officials gave verbal assurances to Garvey and his representatives that they would provide land for African American settlers, allow investment in the country, and collaborate on building infrastructure. The initial support led Garvey to focus heavily on Liberia as the centerpiece of his immigrationist plan. Sudden reversal, part one, I guess. Despite these early promises, Liberian officials eventually reneged on their commitment. Under pressure from external powers like the United States and European colonial interests, and possibly driven by internal corruption and personal interest, the Liberian government withdrew its support for the UNIA's plans. This sudden reversal came as a blow to Garvey's effort and was seen as an act of duplicity, since the Liberians had led the UNIA to believe that their collaboration was solid. Part two, manipulation of the UNIA. Exploiting the UNIA's resources. Liberian officials may have seen Garvey's movement as an opportunity to gain financial or political advantage. By engaging with the UNIA and showing initial support, they were able to gain attention, potential investment, and perhaps leverage in their dealings with foreign powers. However, once they realized that supporting Garvey could endanger their relationships with the U.S. and European powers, they abandoned the partnership, having already extracted whatever benefits they could. Diplomatic opportunism. Liberian officials were politically opportunistic, playing both sides. They engaged with Garvey and the UNIA when it suited them, while simultaneously maintaining relationships with the U.S. and European colonial powers who were wary of Garvey's Pan-Africanism. This duplicity allowed Liberia to balance the interests of multiple parties, but it ultimately undermined the UNIA's ability to implement its plans. And number three, impact of external pressures, pressure from the United States and European powers. Liberia was heavily influenced by external pressures, politically, particularly from the U.S., which had considerable financial and political sway over the country. European colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, also exerted pressure on Liberia to distance itself from Garvey's Pan-Africanist movement, fearing that it could inspire anti-colonial sentiment and destabilize their economy. The Liberian government's duplicitous behavior can be seen as a response to these pressures. While initially appearing to support the UNIA, they reversed course when it became politically inconvenient or dangerous to their relationships with foreign powers. Fear of losing international support. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. It is. Liberia's leaders were concerned that a formal alliance with Garvey's movement could lead to international isolation or financial repercussions, as Western powers, particularly the U.S., threatened to withdraw support if Liberia aligned too closely with the UNIA. The Liberian government's reversal reflected this calculation, prioritizing their relationships with more powerful external allies over their commitments to the UNIA. Frustration of the UNIA's immigrationist plans. Failure to secure land for settlement. One of the most tangible effects of Liberian duplicity was the failure to secure land for African American settlers. Despite earlier promises, the Liberian government refused to provide the land necessary for the UNIA's planned immigration and settlement project. This was a major setback for Garvey's efforts, as securing land in Liberia was central to the UNIA's immigrationist agenda. Is that it? Okay. Okay. Undermining of the immigration movement. The Liberian government's duplicity undermined Garvey's larger vision of African American repatriation and the establishment of a strong, independent, black-led state in Africa. By withdrawing their support, the Liberian officials effectively blocked the possibility of large-scale immigration, forcing Garvey to reconsider his plans and weakening the UNIA's credibility in the eyes of some of its followers. Part 5 is damage to Garvey's reputation, loss of credibility. The Liberian government's duplicity also had damaging effects on Garvey's personal reputation and the UNIA's broader mission. The failure of the Liberian government, which had been a central part of Garvey's Pan-African vision, led to frustration among Garvey's supporters. Some began to question his leadership and the feasibility of the UNIA's plans, as the Liberian government's reversal made it seem as though Garvey had overpromised or miscalculated in his dealings with Liberia. Internal UNIA setbacks. The breakdown of the Liberian project contributed to internal challenges within the UNIA, as members who placed their hopes in the success of the repatriation plan were disillusioned. This setback further complicated Garvey's leadership, as he had to navigate both external opposition and growing frustration from within his own movement. In conclusion, the Machiavellianism and duplicity of the Liberian government had a profound impact on the UNIA's Liberian efforts. By initially promising support and then reneging on those promises under pressures from external powers and external political calculations, Liberian officials undermined Garvey's immigrationist plans, damaged the credibility of the UNIA, and forced a reevaluation of the entire strategy for African American repatriation. This duplicity, driven by Liberia's need to balance its interests with the demands of foreign powers, was a key factor in the failure of Garvey's efforts to establish a foothold in Liberia as part of his broader Pan-African vision. And no, it wasn't Pan-African vision.
Pan-African.
Yeah.
I think that was the other word we were talking about.
Oh yeah,
The Back to Africa movement and the Pan-African.
Yeah, we don't do no Peter Pan Africanism, no panhandling, and we leave Pan alone. You see Pan, panic. But yeah, this was a good summation of sorts of some of the challenges. But you know, there were a lot of factors involved. I mean, there were a lot of entities involved in the sabotage. You know, certainly, like say, Du Bois' question, I guess, is coming up next. So I'll just save that portion of it because he was the true piece of work. But the Liberia never had good intentions when it came to Mr. Garvey's offer to pay off their debt, which was what the Liberian settlement was largely about. Because the UNIA was indebted, not the UNIA, the Liberian government, I believe, was indebted to the British, And so they were going to pay the British off by getting a loan from the U.S. But U.S. hustlers, these U.S. Colored intellectuals in Du Bois's camp, tried to hustle the Liberian government into giving them 10% of the $5 million loan that they were, or I think it was 20% actually, of the $5 million loan they were trying to get for them. And so when the U.S. government found out that 20% of that loan is going to a few colored intellectuals in the U.S., they backed out of the agreement. And so now Liberia was, getting deeper in debt to the British. So that's when Mr. Garvey came up with a loan offer. He said, well, we can pay up to $2 million and we can get so much land and we can build roads and bridges and schools and all these things that are needed so that we can improve, the country. And so initially in correspondence between the Liberian officials, you can see how they all were talking about, yeah, maybe we should pay this guy for every dollar we can get out of him. And maybe once we got what we need, we can just take his money and kick him in his behind and send him on his way. So they thought it was kind of sweet until Eli Garcia went over there and found out what the deal was. And so, he was telling Garvey basically, you need to bring an army over here because these jokers are not playing. And so he kind of knew what was going on. But when they knew that he knew what was going on, that's when the whole deal started to change and all these, deceptive agreements became more obvious. And that's when they brought in old faithful Du Bois. But there's a reason they brought Du Bois in at that time to be the diplomatic agent for the U.S. government during C.D.B. King's inauguration in 1924. And that was an exploitation of Du Bois they were working. But I'll bring that up when that subject comes up. But yeah, it was a whole lot going on that is not covered in here. But I mean, you can't cover everything in the chapter. So.
Right. Yeah, it's a very packed chapter, and we're not even, getting all the details, but yeah, absolutely. It's amazing how sabotage happens, and how it's just, we have to read this stuff and learn and circumvent and plan strategically and avoid as much as possible stuff like this. But otherwise history just kind of repeats itself. I mean, the circumstances are way different today, but you almost have to be a step ahead all the time, no matter what time period you're in, So, but anyway, I guess I could go ahead and just do 19 real quickly. So this is saying what were some of the internal problems that the UNIA within Liberia began to experience. Now, we touched on a few of them earlier, but it's saying that according to Tony Martin, the UNIA began to experience several internal problems within Liberia that contributed to the failure of Marcus Garvey's ambitious immigrationist and development plan. These internal challenges, in combination with external pressure, ultimately determined the UNIA's effort, undermined rather, the UNIA's effort in Liberia. Some of the major internal problems with the UNIA encountered were leadership conflicts and factionalism. So that would include disputes among UNIA officials. That would include divisions over strategy. You can go ahead and advance, Brother John. So divisions over strategy. And number 2, inadequate organizational structure. Logical and administrative challenges would include inexperienced leadership. Also financial difficulties, which would include limited funding for different projects and inefficiency in resource allocation. And then number 4 is disillusionment among settlers. So that would include unmet expectations, discontent, attrition. And then That would also be cultural and social tension with native Liberians. So tension between African Americans and indigenous Liberians, and then also competing interest. And then challenges of securing land, which would include internal mismanagement, in land acquisition, also legal and bureaucratic obstacles. Also communication breakdown. So poor communication with the UNIA leadership in New York, failure to report problems. So in conclusion, the internal problem experienced by the UNIA in Liberia, such as leadership conflicts, organizational inefficiencies, financial difficulties, disillusionment among settlers, tension with local Liberians, and challenges in securing land were significant factors in the ultimate failure of Garvey's immigrationist effort in Liberia. So these internal issues combined with external pressures and diplomatic setbacks prevented the UNIA from realizing its ambitious goal in Liberia and contributed to the overall decline of the organization's influence in the region. Okay, so number 20, I'll just continue reading, I guess. What caused relations to deteriorate between potentate Johnson and Critchlow? So according to Martin, relations between potentate Gabriel Johnson, the Liberian political leader, and Cyril Critchlow, a prominent representative of the UNIA in Liberia, deteriorated due to the combination of conflicting interests, misunderstanding, and broader political dynamics. So Critchlow had been appointed by Marcus Garvey to oversee the UNIA's immigration and development efforts in Liberia, but his intentions with the Liberian government, particularly with potentate Johnson, became increasingly strained. So here are a few reasons for the breakdown in the relationship. Number one is conflicting interest and distrust. So that would include political differences. It would include mutual distrust. And then number two is Liberian government's change in stance. So that would include reversal of support and also political pressures on Johnson. Number three is miscommunication and misunderstandings. So that would include breakdown in the communication, failure to address concerns. So, and then competing visions for Liberia, which would include different goals for Liberia's future. It would also include concerns over sovereignty. And number five is Critchlow's increasing criticism of Liberian leadership. So public criticism, breakdown in cooperation, and in conclusion, the deterioration of relations between potentate Gabriel Johnson and Cyril Critchlow was primarily driven by conflicting interests, political pressures, and miscommunication, while Johnson and the Liberian government were concerned with maintaining political stability and managing external pressures. Critchlow and the UNIA were focused on implementing large-scale immigration and development plans. As these differing priorities came to the surface, tensions escalated, leading to public criticism and a breakdown in cooperation. Ultimately, the deteriorating relationship between Johnson and Critchlow contributed to the failure of the UNIA's efforts in Liberia. So we could continue some more if you guys have but it is 9:58, and or we can, just continue wrapping it up with the quick reading version, and then jump on to the Black Star Line questions next week. So the Black Star Line won't have as many questions. Because it just, it wasn't as, it was kind of convoluted, but because we're talking about the same things and the same type of sabotage on the various ships, the shipping lines, from different sources, internal, external, and we should have shorter questions for that chapter. So I'm thinking next we could wrap up the rest of this and do the Black Star Line questions.
May I?
Yes, please go ahead.
I don't know whether it was mentioned the tension between the Americo-Liberians and the indigenous people created a lot of problems. Also, I would like to hear from Brother Camus, what effect did that have upon the teachings of the Honorable, the teachings of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, because the Americo-Liberians Liberians came over with an attitude basically of aristocracy and treated the indigenous people in a very negative way. And it wasn't even too much later in the latter part of this century that Sergeant Doe was able to enhance that a little, not enhance it, but put a resolution to that disparity between the Americo-Liberians, because as far as I can understand, they were like not the inhabitants, but many of them were children of the former slave master, and they brought over that same mentality, which they imposed upon the indigenous people. And it took them centuries in order for them to climb out from underneath that. So I feel quite certain back in the 20s and the 30s that these people were still in dominant rule, and quite naturally they're going to play in the corner of their American heritage, which is basically the European mindset of their former slave masters. Maybe Brother Camus could give us some information on that.
Oh, I would love to, Brother Ormond, if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead, Brother Murray.
You sound like my old urban studies teacher, Brother Ormond. He used to always say one statement, was you hear it almost every day from him: the oppressed always want to imitate the oppressor.
Yes.
And boy, did they not come over there with all that American Western dominant silliness and impose it on a lot of the indigenous Liberians. Now, the interesting thing is the relationship of the Johnson family, which is a story in and of itself, because I don't agree with some of the opinions of Dr. Tony Martin when it comes to the Johnsons. But to be fair to him, he didn't have all the information that came much later after he wrote the book. So, some of the truth of the Johnson family came out because Gabriel Moore Johnson, who was the potentate, he was actually the he was the son of Hillary Johnson, who was the first American. He was a Americo-Liberian, but he was born in Liberia. So he was actually the first Liberian-born president of that country, even though he was, again, of Americo-Liberian stock. In fact, it was he that later adopted Jamul Johnson, or Jamul from the God clan, or God nation, I should say, in Liberia, who's later he mentored and made him the first native representative of Liberia, or whatever the parliament member position is over there. But he made him the first representative, made him an attorney, adopted him and raised him. And his Jamul Johnson's daughter actually became Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was, the first woman to be president in Liberia, etc. So anyway, it was a long connection with that. But Johnson issue, when he went back to Liberia, his was more financial. He was in debt up to his eyebrows with all kinds of loans he had taken out from people. And so when he had resources from the UNIA to go buy specific land for the UNIA, he went to some people who had some land, some worthless land they wanted to sell, who he was in debt to, and he said, "Yeah, I'll buy that land from you. We're using UNIA money if you let me." And so he wound up buying stuff he wasn't supposed to buy, which irritated the commissioner Critchlow. And during that same time, again, there were some people over there claiming to be UNIA who were executed by the government. There were people over there who claimed UNIA who mysteriously died, like the Supreme Court Justice J.J. Dosen, who was working with the UNIA to make sure that everything went over properly. Then there were people over there. Well, in the same time, in 1924, when all this was going down, the main connection with Liberia was John Edward Bruce, and he happened to die, unfortunately, during that same period. So all of our, in the same year, Secretary General Robert Lincoln Poston died after leaving Liberia. So anyway, it was a tragic time, and some of the leading members of the organization who were connected with the Liberia Project died. A lot was going on at that time. There was some crookedness going on at that time. And then because everybody was dying all around Critchlow, again, he got scared and gave all the UNIA documents to the enemies of the UNIA in the American ambassador's office. Now, when it comes to the relationship, the relationship was good between UNIA and most of the native Liberians. They were the ones that most eagerly anticipating Garvey, because they knew Mr. Garvey wasn't coming over there with that same nonsense that those Americo-Liberians were imposing on the people. So you'll see a lot of photos even of the UNIA when they first came over as delegates in 24. Not first came over, but the delegates in 24, Henrietta Davis, Milton Van Lowe, and Poston. They had taken pictures with all the native Liberians, and people welcomed them everywhere. And they were celebrated. Because Miss Garvey wasn't coming with that Western ideology to impose upon the people. He respected the people's culture and made sure that, he put that in a lot of his messages, that we weren't coming over here as overlords of anybody's culture, but we coming to help to develop, technologically and industrially the country. So anyway, but he was, bringing over settlements of 500 families at a time. That was the plan. Once they get the first, settlements established, which they were in the process of doing when the boys came on the scene, and we working with Firestone, and one of their backers decided to make the deal for some land in Liberia. They had the blessings of the United States government, because the United States government was warning them if they let Mr. Garvey over there that they were going to possibly attack or let the British attack Liberia and destroy their leadership. So but when Firestone came, and Du Bois was chosen to be by the President of the United States at the time, Coolidge chose Du Bois to be the minister plenipotentiary, or the leading political figure, the diplomatic agent for the United States government, to be represented at Liberia, which was the highest order you can get in the U.S. government. So he was proud to go over there, and later he wrote an article in the Council of Foreign Relations newspaper, the first black man to write in that racist organization's newspaper about his trip. But this joker went over there and tried everything he could to undermine Mr. Garvey's plans and put Liberia in, and promised them the world, even though he knew openly that Liberia was going to be exploited by these same people. Gabriel Moore Johnson knew that Liberia was going to be exploited by these same people, and he and the president, CDB King, had talked about it. And that's when CDB King, Johnson failed to become mayor again of Monrovia. More or less, they thought he was going to possibly be president one day of Liberia, but when he couldn't even win the mayoral seat, he basically was nothing in Liberia. So what King decided to do was to run him away from the UNIA. He made some statement about he can't be part of two governments, and so since he's with government of UNIA and government of Liberia, he had to choose one or the other, which was nonsense. Mr. Garvey corrected him that we were not a government and we weren't trying to come over there and do all the stuff that you said we were. So anyway, but Gabriel Moore Johnson wound up getting sent to Ferdinand Poe, which was another plantation where they were trying to extract rubber, etc. And he was working on behalf of CDB King there, because there was a lot of enslaved native Liberians over there who was working the fields. So anyway, he was over there to pimp the people. The boys came over knowing that Firestone was going to enslave people, about hundreds of thousands. In fact, that's what eventually, I think in 28, is when the League of Nations had to intercede and declared later on by the Guinness Book of World Records, that the worst president in the history of the entire world was CDB King, for enslaving his people about hundreds of thousands the way he did for so many years, even up to 100 years that was going on, till just, recently, supposedly, where it ended and people were dying in mass, working on these damn rubber plantations. But this was the worst, most rotten, evil government that ever existed. And Du Bois was too happy to be a part of it because he thought he can bring over some of his light-skinned, colored, intellectual friends and have them run the government, for the U.S. government as proxies. And so it was a whole lot of dirty scheming, lying, trickery going on. And unfortunately, we couldn't establish a settlement in order to, correct all that stuff before it was too late. So a lot of things went wrong at the last minute. A lot of tricks were played that, we've seen through a lot of them, but in the end, we were inheriting a losing position on the chessboard. And so we made the best moves that could be made and did as much as could have been done. But ultimately, it didn't pan out the way it should have. But it was a lesson in there. And eventually we did, the successor, Marcus Garvey, James Robert Stewart, did eventually establish a settlement over there in Liberia that's now operated by Michael Duncan on the farm and some other things. But the Stewart family went over there and established some institutions, some restaurants, some schools, all kinds of businesses over there. And the President Tubman at the time later became the potentate of the UNIA in 1954. So we did have a president of an independent African nation actually as potentate of the organization. Unfortunately, the UNIA did some splitting at that time, and so it was, one half of the group here and the other half there. But speaking also, I just wanted to mention, speak too quickly, I know we over time, but I wanted to speak to what Brother Orman mentioned about Sam Doe, which was correct. I don't know if you know, but in 1966 in Liberia and Monrovia, the UNIA that was headed by Thomas W. Harvey at the time had established Marcus Garvey Memorial Institute in Monrovia, Liberia. And one of the graduate students was a young man named Master Sergeant Sam Doe. And he later rose to power, like you said, and because he was with one of the smallest and, as they characterized them, less educated other tribes or nations at that time, he did away with a lot of all that discrimination by these dominant, arrogant, tribes, that were running the country. And he, unfortunately, did a lot of damage to some of the students of the school, which were found hanging from trees and lampposts and all this stuff during that war. But it was, anyway, there's a lot of history with the UNIA and Liberia, even under Tolbert's administration. But yeah, but the UNIA had influence every step of the way, decade after decade. Even if we, some of us don't understand that history or know the history. But yeah, anyway, that's another story altogether. We got time for about Reverend Harding and his program over there and how successful it was, along with Stewarts and other folks who went over there. Some of the original 1921 delegates, even like Frank Lawrence and Rupert Jameau and others, went back and set up farms and did things. And hundreds of people from Jamaica in the UNIA wind up going to Liberia and setting up farms and businesses and became heads of state, etc. Even the Stewart, one of James R. Stewart's sons, became a general over there in Liberia. And that was the one that had a child with Charles L. James's daughter. But anyway, that's another whole story. But a lot of history. I just wish I had time to say more of it, so y'all get hip on some of this stuff.
All right, thank you, bro.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brother Mariama. Yeah, I suppose, it would be like a 1,000-page book if Tony Martin captured everything. But, there's always detail to everything, and sometimes things are a little complex, but they just, can capture so much of it. But it's fascinating, and I think, not everybody's gonna mass migrate to Africa, but we're seeing more and more interest in that. And I think just learning that, I think what impacted some of the conflict is just, or not really conflict, but just the attitude, like you say, adopting the colonial attitude, and then basically adopting the propaganda that these people can't govern themselves. And of course, some of that exists where there is corruption, but you know, of course, corruption is usually deeper than it appears. More than one per people. I mean, one person can't be corrupt by themselves, so it can get complicated. But in any event, I thank you guys. Thanks everyone for contributing tonight. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we could wrap up the rest of these. It's not too many left, and then we can hop into the other set of questions on the Black Star Line next week. So I guess we can push a pin here where we're leaving off and pick up then. And Brother Mariamar, please take us out since you do such a good job at that.
My pleasure. Yes, one of my favorites, "Oh Africa Awaken." Just do the first stanza and you know, the motto. Oh Africa awaken, thy morning is at hand. No more art thou forsaken, for is motherland. From far thy sons and daughters are hastening back to thee. Their cries ring over the waters that Africa shall be free. Oh Africa, old Africa, old Africa, awaken to God, lift up thine eyes. One God,
One God,
one aim,
one aim,
Name.
one destiny.
one destiny.
Wait, first. I'll send out the.
First.
I'll send out.
Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Yes, sir.
Race first. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Wow. Appreciate everyone in the call tonight.